Hi everyone.
Hi.
How are we doing? All right. Still having fun?
Yes.
Good. Me too. I love the learning that I'm doing myself for this class. A couple folks had emailed about the elections last week and how it would impact some of the conversations that we've been having. So before we dive in, very, very quickly, two Democrats lost their re-election bids, North Dakota, Indiana, that were on the Senate Ag Committee. There's a runoff election in Mississippi that will impact who serves from either a Democrat or Republican. But in general, the makeup of the Senate Ag Committee will not change in numbers and in nature. The House, on the other side, because the Democrats took the House, there will be Colin Peterson, who, if you remember from one of the videos about week one when he was talking about subsidies and the Farm Bill, he will once again be the chair of the House Ag Committee from Minnesota, and two Republicans either left or lost their seats, including Joe Faso from upstate from Ulster County, and so the Democrats will be in the majority. So what I know is what I read, and a lot of what I read is from the morning Politico reports on the Farm Bill. So I will always encourage you guys to read those. You can really scan it and pay as close attention to it as you'd like. But I get good information from there. And really what people seem to think is that there will be a compromise bill in the lame duck session. It is, as we know, agriculture is not a partisan issue. And the Democrats really got hammered pretty hard in rural states. So they're going to politically want to make sure that they, reach a compromise themselves before the end of the year. There needs to be closure on these issues. And for House Republicans, this is the best shot they're going to get to have any of their interests in the next Farm Bill before it switches over to a House majority. So my guess is that we're going to see some type of compromise and a Farm Bill will be signed in the next 2 months or so. But your guess is as good as mine. So we're going to dive into tonight's class. And you were asked to document for tonight for an assignment, advertisements that you saw as you were walking around. And my confession is that I took a picture of this ad over the summer walking from the subway to my office, and I took a picture and I immediately emailed it to like 5 of my colleagues because I loved it. I love this ad, right? And I know that I asked you guys to look at unhealthy messages or what stood out, but for me it's like I said to my colleagues, we need to advertise like this. We need to send out this same kind of message, right? We've been talking here about supporting the food system that you want to see. If you want fair prices for farmers, right, and if you want there to be growing practices that are treating our environment properly, it's going to cost more money. And so I was grabbed by this ad. It was powerful. Its message was powerful. But Next Confession is not powerful enough that I actually did any research on the product. Like, are their claims actually true? Nor have I purchased it. So it captured me in concept, but it did not get me to what its ultimate goal was, right?
Do you normally drink coconut water though?
I do occasionally. But the goal of food companies, right, are to sell us products, right? To make money for their investors, report quarterly growth to Wall Street, and I love this quote by Miriam, and I'm going to read some things from her, and we're going to watch a very short clip from her. But basically, what she claims is food is no different than the pharmaceutical industry, the tobacco industry, right? Their jobs are to sell us. And we're not going to have too much videos tonight, but I am going to play this.
Simple, that he was able to, he's a brilliant writer, and he was able to do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Really, that takes care of it. It really, really is that simple. I have a slightly different way of putting it. I say if you're concerned about obesity, you need to make better food choices. You need to eat less in general, and you need to move more. I'm not going to say too much about physical activity, but it's very important. And please don't eat my book. But if it seems like it's more complicated than that, it's because of what happens with eating better. The American Dietary Guidelines, and I'm an American and I'm going to be speaking mostly about United States examples, but the American Dietary Guidelines tell you to eat more fruits and vegetables, to choose meats in small amount, meat and dairy in small amounts, and to minimize consumption of heavily processed foods. But the problem is that heavily processed foods are the most profitable foods in the food system, and there's an enormous financial incentive for food companies to make those kinds of products. Fruits and vegetables are not very profitable, and that's a big problem in the system. So the food industry has responded to a lot of activism around food that I'm going to be talking about by putting an enormous fortune into advertising highly processed foods. And these are numbers for individual products. So Pop-Tarts had a $30 million budget advertising in the United States, and that's just Pop-Tarts and just the kind of money that goes through advertising agency. Coca-Cola, $254 million last year. I mean, these are staggering sums of money in nutrition education terms. I can assure you that the government doesn't spend anywhere near the amount of money that's spent on one product. So that creates a food system that promotes the kinds of foods that people really should be eating less of. Another change.
So I have always said in my work that subsidies and advertising are the 2 greatest challenges that the sustainable agriculture community has to overcome. I mean, $30 million just in Pop-Tart advertising, that was one of the lower numbers. That's over 6 years of my budget, and we're one of the larger nonprofits in this field. That's 30 years worth of SNAP redemptions at Greenmarkets. And like I said, that's a small number. My numbers are a little bit different than Marion's. I have Coke coming in at $377 million, right? Pepsi at $169. And you also saw Gatorade, and PepsiCo actually owns Gatorade. So they're spending almost $300 million as well. So Chick-fil-A, $72 million. But the biggest one is McDonald's. McDonald's spent 2.7 times as much to advertise its products as all fruit, vegetables, bottled water, and milk advertisers combined.
Is this just in the United States?
This is just the United States. Thank you very much. Yep, this is just in the US alone. Right? And we know that advertising has changed. Right? So now there's digital marketing. You walk into a store and something will pop, through a push notification, products will appear on your phone, or you walk by a restaurant and an ad will pop up encouraging you to buy something, whether it's a special or the product that's being featured that day. On your Facebook pages, right? On your Gmail, on your Google searches. And we will look next week or for the next session when we talk about public health impacts, how this has been further exacerbated through the redlining that we looked at in our last class, and how junk food is further targeted. But I ask here, like, should we be using the same tools? So at Greenmarket, we're starting to explore those same push notifications around broccoli, right? So when you walk near a farmer's market or vicinity of a market, should we notify you that you are in proximity, right? Should we notify you that today there's a special on broccoli and that this is the history of broccoli? Because what I read this week is that if we're going to impact public health, and if we're going to really flip the script, it needs to be the go-to. The go-to needs to be that we are bombarded, the same images that people are constantly seeing has to be those healthy images if we're going to make a dent in this. And that's particularly true when we're looking at food marketing to children. So in 2016, television advertising for children averaged 10 to 11 ads per day, or nearly 4,000 ads for the year. And this is just food-related advertising on children's channels. And again, this is TV ads just for kids on children's television shows. Less than 10% of advertisements promoted healthy products in healthier categories. For adults, they're seeing significantly more food-related TV ads than compared with children, which is a great increase from 2007. And on my next slide, I'll tell you why 2007 is an important year. Children did see fewer food-related TV ads in 2016 than in 2007. However, those reductions have been offset by two main factors. One is that there is an increase in ads shown per hour on TV, non-kids programming that kids are watching. So like I said, there's an increase for the adults because there's greater advertising on adult shows and kids are watching more adult shows. And that advertising is now coming through those other mechanisms. Research in England showed that young people aged 5 to 15 spend about 15 hours a week online, which overtook the time that they were spent watching TV. And my kids also play video games and are on their little devices every now and then with limited hours. So our second and last video, which I like for a couple reasons. One, it really highlights what kids are looking at, but also that there are now groups out there that are working against it and are educating parents how to think strategically to minimize the impact.
If you've got kids watching TV, and who doesn't, you've got kids watching junk food ads. With their dancing leprechauns and cuddly polar bears, companies do a great job selling their products in the most entertaining and memorable ways.
But I won't do that!
And for young kids, this kind of marketing is especially hard to resist. Today, billions of dollars are spent on marketing sugary cereals, soda, snacks, and fast food. And it goes beyond TV ads to movie tie-ins, product placement, and celebrity endorsements.
Embrace your past, but live for now.
Popular junk food products often use cartoon characters and even have their own websites, apps, social media pages, and interactive games. So how can parents steer kids away from all the calls for unhealthy snacks? First, avoid the ads. Use DVDs or DVRs to skip the commercials. Also, watch the websites kids visit, since some popular gaming sites are really entertaining commercials in disguise. Next, ID those ads. When you watch TV or play online with your kids, point out the products and logos used as props in the storyline, and let them know the goal of all this is to sell something. Finally, talk about the star factor. Lots of companies want their product to appear cool.
Platinum album. Super Bowl.
Remind your kid that the athlete tweeting a photo with his favorite soft drink is probably being paid to do so. While many food marketers are starting to make an effort to be more responsible in their marketing, packaging, and ingredients, it's still important to talk to your kids about which of these efforts produce genuinely healthy results and which are simply trying to cash in on a trend. For more tips and advice, check out our mobile app or visit us at commonsense.org. I'm Lori Burke.
So, like I said, I like that ad because so often I do not present in here the positive ways that people have responded. And here's Common Sense Media helping educate, one, what's out there, and to really think through as a parent, how you can be engaging your child. I looked through so many ads, and children's ads in preparation for tonight, and read lots of different stats. And one of those stats is that kids that actually do watch TV alone and play video are on devices alone without any parental involvement actually do have high increased rates of diet-related illnesses. In the United States, our approach to limiting how often and what we advertise to children has been self-regulated. So in 2007, the Better Business Bureau created the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative. Right? This was in response to alarming rates of childhood obesity, and it basically was self-regulation. So the criteria that was created by industry itself, and for the first 6 years, all of the participants self-selected their own nutrition criteria, and then in basically 2014, or the last day of 2013, there was standardization of what those curricula would be, including sugar reductions in cereals and yogurts, more whole grains, some sodium reductions, and there are new criteria that are about to be introduced that would go into effect in 2020, because 40% of the food that's currently allowed through self-regulation would be banned to be advertised to young people through the new food labeling regulations. And again, going back to that first quote, the bottom line, the first quote from Marion, similar to that, is the bottom line is that restaurants and processed food industries are for profit. They're not going to risk huge drops in sales, right, by putting themselves ahead of our current unhealthy food culture, even if they each played a major role in creating that culture. So as long as American kids are clamoring for hot dogs and fries in chain restaurants, or for Fruit Loops and Gushers in the grocery aisle, these industries will absolutely make sure those items are offered and marketed to them. And the reason why she talks about Gushers and Fruit Loops is because under the current guidelines, they're actually eligible, right? All of these products are eligible. And these are the companies who are self-regulated. And I want you to hear the names and think about them throughout tonight. Burger King, Mars, Campbell's, Kraft Heinz Foods, Coca-Cola, ConAgra. Oh, I did Mars twice. I love them so much. McDonald's, General Mills, Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, Kellogg's, Post, and Mondelez, right? Like I said, this is what self-regulation looks like. It's a Happy Meal. It's getting a toy in the Burger King kids meal, and it's products that actually, when I go to the supermarket and turn over the sugar content for the popsicles, I will not buy for my own children. That doesn't mean that I don't buy my kid a cheeseburger and a milkshake every Friday night from Emoji Burger. But we have conversations about what that means, where the food is coming from, and what good food choices mean and what bad food choices mean. And I continue to make bad food choices. Right? And yeah.
I just wanted to, when you were talking about commonsense.org, I just wanted to bring up that most of the interventions that seem to work with young kids and even teens is the same thing that worked with smoking, which was the Truth Campaign, right? Which is the idea of alerting kids that they're being manipulated by marketers to buy and nag their families for unhealthy foods. So it's just that seems to be kind of what they're talking about. I just wanted to bring that up, and the NIH actually did a program, kind of a media training program, and there's a lot of kits online for educators to actually, and I'll send it to you and we'll send it out.
Great, thank you.
For people to see.
Yeah, I mean, I know that my children like to be empowered with information, and they like to make choices for themselves and feel good about making good choices for themselves.
How old are they?
Almost 9 and almost 11. And similarly to what we've been learning about on the production side, there is significant consolidation on the grocery side, right? The top companies earn nearly 63% of the total sales in over 100 grocery categories. I know many of you have seen this image before. In 30 categories, 4 or fewer companies took in over 75% of total sales. Go Google baby food formulas and see what the consolidation looks like in baby food. It's staggering. And then, so even when you think that you have a choice, often if the same larger firm is selling the same product, made in the same factory, but under a different brand name. Right, so we're constantly getting bombarded with messages of who we should be purchasing from and what we should be purchasing. And then at the same time, these same companies are now influencing what university research is being conducted about food, right, and about policy. So prior to 1980, any research that was done using federal funding, the federal government held a patent to what was created through that research. In 1980, that changed and allowed universities, small businesses, and other nonprofits to hold those patents, right? And by the early 90s, what we saw was that industry surpassed the USDA in funding ag research at public state land-grant universities, to the tune of $822 million to $645 million. And these have been what some of the results have been, right? So USDA funding to extension services decreased by around 12% between 2001 and 2010. So what does that mean, right? When you undercut ag extension services that are affiliated with land-grant universities, that are delivering research findings to farmers through outreach, trainings, and educational materials, right? It limits the ability of extension staff to provide farmers with independent, research-based advice about what are the best ag practices, right? That this corn is better than this other corn without any interest other than what that farmer is going to produce best, right? So farmers are now turning more and more to agribusiness for advice on the best practices and products. In real life, what this means in the city of New York, Just Food, East New York Farms, Added Value, and the Rikers Farm and Compost Project were all started with Cornell Cooperative Extension agents supporting those initiatives. We just got back 2 urban extension agents from Cornell after years of having none in the city. And then we watched in week 2, Rick Bishop, right, the TriStar. So that TriStar strawberry was created by Cornell Cooperative Extension with farmers. They looked at which microclimate and which region it would grow in best. And then those seeds were shared with those farmers rather than with the corporation that purchased the patent from the university. Which brings me to point 2. Once industry exceeded USDA in terms of research, there was supposed to be, to the benefit of the university, when there was a transfer of technology to the corporations to get paid for that. That's not, in fact, what's happening. So public universities have provided breakthrough research in biotechnology, like it or not, that fueled the development of Monsanto's signature products, bovine growth hormone, and Roundup Ready crops. Right? Cornell University scientists invented the first genetic engineering process, but sold it to DuPont in 1990, essentially privatizing a valuable asset. And so biotech's industry's use of university research to develop these highly profitable products, which are often dubious benefits to farmers and dubious benefits to farmers and consumers, is at odds with the mission of land-grant universities. And that transfer in technology is not matched with the transfer in income back to those universities. We also see that industry-funded studies, the results are skewed towards the industry. 15% of university scientists acknowledge having changed the design, methodology, or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source. right? We read for this week that a study funded by the National Soft Drink Association found that soda consumption by school children was not linked to obesity. An egg nutrition center, I'm from Pittsburgh, so I say egg. An egg nutrition center sponsored study found that frequent egg consumption did not increase blood cholesterol levels. You see with Mars here, because I love bringing up Mars, but also that one Cornell professor was a paid Monsanto consultant while also publishing journal articles promoting the benefits of bovine growth hormone for dairy farms, right? And that research is then used in regulatory submissions to the FDA, and despite FDA approval, that same bovine growth hormone has not been approved for commercial use in the European Union, Canada, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand due to the concerns about its impact on animal health, right? And then we also see that there's a chilling effect on academic research. I'm going to read a passage. If Marion had said this on video, we'd be watching a video instead of have to hear my voice. But I think this hammers home a very important point. I must confess that in my current position, I find it impossible to avoid entanglements with food companies. Lobbying groups for the salt, sugar, vitamin, and omega-3 fatty acid industries routinely send me information and research articles about the nutritional benefits of these substances, as do trade associations for food as diverse as wheat, soybeans, blueberries, peanuts, pistachios, and flaxseed. Public relations and scientific staff of companies such as Procter & Gamble and Unilever visit my department regularly to consult about products under development. I give speeches at meetings overtly sponsored by food companies and at meetings organized by professional societies who receive funding from such companies. I read journals subsidized by food companies. I speak on panels with food company representatives. I have held grants from food companies. I have asked food company representatives for their newsletters, books, press materials, and teaching slides. I occasionally consult for food companies. Such interactions are the norm among academic nutritionists. Only questioning them is unusual. This book addresses that gap. I also must confess that I am fully aware that not everyone is as able as I am to discuss these issues. I hold a tenured, hard money, full professorship, and New York University pays me my entire salary. Furthermore, my research focuses on food and nutrition policy. Unlike most other nutrition academics, I do not require expensive laboratories, nor do I need to generate my own research funding. In this privileged position, I can afford to be independent of the food industry. Some years ago, concerned that accepting funding from food companies might compromise this independence, I attempted to develop a personal policy to deal with sponsorship matters. As I disclose in several places in this book, I go to meetings sponsored by food companies and accept travel funds and public relations materials, but I do not personally accept honoraria or any other payment. Instead, I ask companies to donate the funds to our department's scholarship fund. This policy, imperfect though as it may be, works for me. In revealing it, I hope to stimulate debate about its merits and to encourage colleagues to consider creating their own versions, right? But not in what we read for this week. You saw that not many researchers and universities either have that freedom or two, want it, right? The growing dependence on corporate funding discourages academics from pursuing research that might challenge the business practices of their funders, or that irks money-hungry administrators who grant tenure to professors. A 2005 University of Wisconsin survey of land-grant agricultural scientists found that the amount of grant and contract money that professors generate had a significant influence over their tenure and salaries, right? This chilling effect discourages academic research on environmental, public health, and food safety risks related to industrial agriculture, and explains the sparse research on alternatives to the dominant agricultural model. So, you read for this week this study on the relationship between land-grant universities and research, right? And here are examples of buildings and departments that are funded by corporations. Cargill, Walmart, Monsanto, ConAgra, Kroger, Tyson, Walmart, right? Here's academic studies, academic departments funded by the private sector. Monsanto, Pepsi, Nestle, Pfizer, right? Philip Morris, Monsanto. You're gonna get sick of my voice saying these same things. Mars, there they are. Syngenta. And I can keep scrolling doing this for hours, right? And so also what was discussed in this article was that policymakers and regulators demand a scientific basis for policy changes and regulatory decisions, right? And agribusiness is financing those experiments and funding the scientists. So the regulatory approval process requires companies to submit field and laboratory testing data, such as biotech seeds. And again, because that testing data is paid for the industry, it's lending credibility to these regulatory applications. It's greasing the wheels for approval of safety of controversial new products, while at the same time, it prohibits independent research of these patented products, limiting the public's ability to understand the risks and preventing scientists from submitting critical comments to federal regulators. So that is where we are getting how our academic research is happening. This is a little side note. When I was reading through through these articles and looking where the hard data was found, these are some of the sites that they get the hard data from. Marion talks about using congressional hearing reports, federal registers, General Accounting Office reports, and a host of others. So as you're reading articles, look where it's coming from, right? Look how studies are being developed. Pay attention to the sources for your own reference and to understand how you can incorporate it and why and how the author is reaching the conclusions that he or she is reaching. Is Urvashi here yet?
Yeah.
Okay. You want to come up? Sure. I'm about to turn it over to you. So, I don't know if anyone's ever been on a road trip and they play the game where, like, I'm going on a vacation, I'm going on a trip, and I'm going to take an apple. And the next person says, I'm going to take an apple and a banana. So I'm going to do that, right? We're going to play, I'm going on a vacation and look at the same companies who are bombarding us with messaging, who own the bulk of the brands, who control research, who self-regulate and guide policy, and also spend hundreds of millions of dollars each year, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars each year so that there is not a transparent food system. And where you see the asterisks next to these top companies, those same companies are funding efforts to defeat country of origin labeling. It's the same companies, time and time again, that are driving policy and that own our food system. So with that, I think this is a good time. Yeah, Tutu.
Why isn't the FDA or USDA, I assume they might be interested, but why aren't they developing their own research to counteract this bias?
That is the perfect segue. Perfect segue for our next guest to join us. So Urvashi, Urvashi Rangan is an environmental health scientist and toxicologist with more than 25 years of experience in hazard analysis and risk communication. She has led several investigations of food and consumer products, assessing safety risks and oversight gaps, while also identifying better market choices. Urvashi is particularly interested in evidence-based narratives that can influence marketplace and policy change. She's a national spokesperson and advocate on a wide range of food safety risks, pathogens, pesticides, antibiotic resistance, arsenic, and other carcinogens, as well as sustainable solutions, product choices, and meaningful labels. Urvashi is the Chief Science Advisor to the Grace Communications Foundation, where she works on a wide range of communication and messaging initiatives on sustainable food issues. She is curating strategic messaging conversations among diverse stakeholders on topics like climate and pasture-based livestock systems, regenerative agriculture, labels and the role of organic principles, supporting adversely impacted communities from industrial toxic exposures, and considerations regarding new meat and dairy replacements made from engineered yeast, bacteria, and algae. She has won several awards in investigative journalism and communications, participated in a number of public debates on food systems, testified to Congress and other agencies, as well as served as a member of the FDA Food Advisory Committee. She has participated in dozens of national conversations on sustainable food, including planning and moderating several panels for the 2016 Aspen Ideas Festival. Urvashi spent 17 years at Consumer Reports, leading the Safety and Sustainability Program. In addition to her current role at Grace Communications Foundation, she also consults to foundations and public interest groups. She received her PhD in Environmental Health Studies from Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. So join me in welcoming this week's call.
Thank you. Hi. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Great. Hello and good evening, and I'm really glad to be with you here today. The last time I was up on this stage was Charles in your class, and I think I had full-on flu, so I hope nobody got that. And okay, I want to. There we go. There's so much, right? I mean, when we talk about corporate influence in the food system, and some of it's obvious, some of it's not so obvious. And I'm going to maybe start at a slightly different point than Michael, but I think it works right back to the same kind of themes, which is where's the accountability in this system? Who has to provide what in order to prove it's safe, it's right, it's good, and what are the requirements for that? And the same thing sort of applies whether you're talking about safety of food or whether you're talking about the labeling of food. It's all so complicated out there. And, you know, I remember the Foster Farms recall. Does anybody remember the Foster Farms recall in 2014? It's for a really, really terrible salmonella that was making a lot of people sick. And they didn't recall their chicken for a long, long time, and they were producing chicken at different plants in Portland and in Oregon and in Washington State. The same bacteria that they had been identifying those plants for almost a decade before this particular recall was documenting that same pathogen at those plants. And then in 2014 in California, sickened enough people and went enough places that it sort of triggered a CDC investigation, and they were able to document again the same pathogen associated with that in California. And we had just finished a chicken study, I remember, at the time, and we were calling USDA to brief them on that. But USDA that Friday, we were talking to them on Monday, had issued these notice of intended enforcements against Foster Farms. Finally, so many people had already gotten sick, so much of the commodity had already gone to the market, they weren't recalling it. Costco was buying an enormous amount of this chicken as well. They were even roasting this chicken, and some of the roasted chicken even came back with the pathogen on it. And so, it's always whose fault is that for a long time during these outbreaks. And it isn't until a number of things start to line up that the government will ask the company to take action. And recall authority is really terrible, especially when it comes to meat. There was a Supreme Beef Court case in 1990 that basically took away the authority from the USDA to issue a meat recall. So it's up to the company to issue it, and it isn't until the pathogen that comes out of a very sick person is matched to the package with a plant number on the chicken package that that person ate. Somehow they had to retain that and it didn't go into the trash can, and they had some juice or another meat in it with the plant number on it. And then that is cultured to match the pathogen that came out of that person. Only then will the government say that there's actually a connection. And so the level of evidence for that is so extreme. I always find it really ironic that they have such a high standard of proof when they want to issue a recall, and yet making sure that chicken doesn't have salmonella in the first place, making sure that there are hygiene standards on farms, making sure that we manage manure in an appropriate way, where all this stuff comes from. We don't have very good standards in place. And where we do have standards, a lot of it's really fragmented, and we'll do a little quiz in just a second on that. But it's really unbelievable what it takes to deem something a public health risk before a lot of people get sick. I hear a lot of companies talk about how safe our food system is, and yet you see these outbreaks happen over and over again. And when we talked to the USDA that Monday after these notice of intended enforcements went into these plants, finally saying, look, we're going to enforce and we're going to ask you to shut down and clean up, they took it back. Whatever Foster Farms came back with and said, yeah, we're going to clean this up and here's our plan. On that Monday, USDA basically decided it was fine and they could just keep on selling the stuff. And I remember being so shocked by that and asking them why and how in the world they could really allow that. And they called the head of our DC office and said that I should apologize to them, but it was really unbelievable that they should not be able to take that enforcement. And a couple months later, they shut down some of those plants for cockroach infestation because they were able to do it for that. And that's just an example of how you can have a pathogen causing a huge outbreak and have it in the plant and document it, and still, unless you have enough lines all connected, you won't be able to do anything about it. Whereas if you go in and you find a cockroach infestation, you can actually take action much more quickly. So it's a very lopsided and skewed system, and it doesn't always make sense. And regulation is very fractured in a lot of ways that allows these things to happen. So I just wanted to start off on that sort of anecdote, and now maybe move into talking about our food system and oversight. And so I wanted to make this a little visual and maybe a little bit interactive. So I wonder if you look up at, and is there a little light thing on here? Yeah, good. So up here, these are, this is really about the chicken and who's in charge of all these different aspects of chicken production, all the way from the farm to the market. And I'm sure I've left even some out, but I got to L today, and it's a way to help highlight how fragmented the system is. And so does anybody know, for example, here, these are egg-laying hens that are in cages. These are broiler chickens that are being raised on the floor. Does anyone know what agency is sort of in charge of that system? USDA. Good. Yep. Okay. Let's go to B. So when they sell that chicken and they put labels on it, who's regulating that labeling? So, any other thoughts?
No one.
It's USDA on the chicken breast cutlets. So this all natural, if the company wants to use it, has to go to USDA. They even have to go pre-market, but they don't have to do very much because USDA only says nothing artificial is added to the cut of meat itself, not how the animal is raised or what it ate or anything else. But they have to get a little bit of a check in the box from the USDA with an affidavit. If you see an ad on TV for Purdue chicken, and I just chose Purdue, it could be anybody. Who's regulating that? Federal Trade Commission, yeah, really good. So if it's on TV, and this isn't just chicken, but really any food, it's the Federal Trade Commission's jurisdiction. And then you're into truthful and misleading labeling and advertising laws. So those are a little bit different than the USDA requirements for what the products can actually say. And often, and we'll get into another example, there's not necessarily consistency among how the agencies apply what they understand a claim to be and the level of enforcement. This is to depict, and it's a kind of a nice pile of feed for the chicken. Lots of other things go into feed that aren't so appetizing looking, but all to say, does anybody know who's responsible for animal feed and animal feed requirements and allowances? Not the USDA, so it's the FDA, and the FDA actually offshores that responsibility to the industry called AFCO, and that's the Association of Animal Feed Control Officials, which is an industry-based group which makes decisions about what is allowable in animal feed and what isn't, down to candy, spent baking waste, distiller's grain. Every year they publish a sort of encyclopedic book of what is allowed in animal feed. In poultry, it's sort of the worst case scenario, at least in, yeah.
So can you just repeat the name of that association?
AFCO is the acronym, AAFCO. And it's the American Association of Animal Feed Control Officials. Maybe AAA, but anyway, AAFCO. Feed Control Officials, yeah. Yep.
Do you know what the analog for that, or the parallel in the European Union is?
I don't believe the European Union actually allows industry to make those decisions. So I think it's the EU government itself that's going to make those decisions about what's allowable or not. And they are much more restrictive than we are on a number of levels. Poultry manure, for example, is considered to be a nutrient-dense material for animal feed. And so poultry litter, because the animals are eating so much nutrient, the excess nutrients going into the waste, and the waste is actually deemed a nutritional source in animal feed. So that will get picked up. It may get treated to a certain degree, and then it can go back into poultry feed. It can go back into other animal feed. Yeah.
So I know when you say that, there's probably a lot of like, ew, that's gross factor in this room. But aside from the gross factor, if it is treated, and instead of, using that to just go in the trash, isn't there some sort of value of using that again and feeding the animals?
Yeah, I mean, I think for years we've been using poultry manure as fertilizer to grow crops, and that's a great use for fertilizer. It's what it was meant to do, and through that you allow a kind of natural breakdown of what that is. The trouble with putting it back into food is it can be a vector for pathogens, it can be a vector for contaminants, and it is.
Even after it's treated?
Even after it's treated, it can. There are certain toxins that you can't actually heat out of it. Metals don't get heated out of feed. A lot of contaminants will actually concentrate in feed and in pelletizing things over time. Sterile feed's just kind of weird, and it's not really, you're sterilizing everything and degrading everything in it. So in terms of it being a nutritional source to eat, I would say there's more than just an ick factor, and I think that manure used right and composted well has a very important purpose in our food system, but it should be to fertilize food, not to eat excrement, because that's not what we're meant to eat. It's not what animals are meant to eat either. Okay, so that is feed. Let's see, this in the farm, on the farm, who is regulating on the farm and in those barns? They're a tiny USDA. It's USDA, so they're supposed to be on the farm. I know. I mean, this is really all. It's kind of stunning, actually, at the end of the day. Now, broilers, for example, in a conventional system are indoors. They are generally on sort of bare floor with, you know, a lot of the poultry manure there. There are very few space requirements going on for those birds. I'm sorry, and in this particular case, just talking about space, which is the comparable one, does anybody know who provides space requirements for the birds? Yeah, no. So no one from the government provides space requirements. So that's an industry set standard, and that would be the, you know, for eggs, it's the United Egg Producers. But these are industry standards, or the AMI, which is the American Meat Institute, would do that for, I think they also cover chicken, but or it's the American Poultry Association. But these trade associations are the ones who are actually setting space requirements. And so that may seem like an animal welfare issue. When you cram animals together and things are really dirty, it's also a vector for disease and for bad health going on. And so for chickens, for example, the space requirement that is set for industry for eggs is a sheet of paper. So sort of 8 by 11 is the standard. So these chickens here are meeting the industry standard for space, and the USDA does not provide additional space requirements. Yes?
Can't the states, like at a state level, can't you change the law so that there are some standards like that just happened in the midterms for, I want to say, California or?
Yeah, there's been a controversy going on in organic production around poultry standards, but California, I believe, is one of the states that took it to an extra level. There was also a proposition that went through a while ago that says no caged egg-laying hens in California. And I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with what just happened in the midterm elections, but there are ways for states to, yes, vote in higher standards for the animals that they raise. But in general, for space, it's a federal, you know, if you wanted to go lowest common denominator, it's the trade associations which are providing the space requirements for industry. Yep.
Do you know how they choose, like, which agency or which, like, industry regulated organization is in charge of what? Like, how are they making choices for
Who regulates what?
Yeah.
There's some method to the madness. If you'll hold on that, I'll get to that slide and we'll kind of, you know, for this, let's kind of get through this and then I'll show you on the next slide and kind of, there's no real good answer to it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that it was parsed out to different agencies based on their legal jurisdictions. But what it did do in the end is food became a great example that breaks up across so many different agencies that things fall through the cracks, things aren't consistent, and that's part of the reason we have so much trouble enforcing consistent standards in the food system. Yeah.
So there's setting the regulation, and then there's enforcing the regulation. So the industry can set the regulation, but the industry groups don't enforce it. Does anyone enforce? Do other people come and say, well, that you're not complying with the industry group?
Or
is it not enforced at all?
No, the government's not going to enforce an industry standard per se unless, like FDA, they have legally given authority over to the, in this case, AFCO, to the American Association of Feed Control Officials. So I do believe if something went wrong in feed, FDA could enforce AFCO, or AFCO could go to FDA and get them to help them to enforce. In the case of space, if a trade association is setting that standard, the government doesn't have any kind of obligation nor right really to enforce it. The United Egg Producers have their own seal, for example, and if a company voluntarily decides to get that seal, then one could see an FTC claim of misleading and untruthful labeling, and then it goes through to have the United Egg Producers be accountable for that labeling and for that producer using that claim. And in that case, that producer would be accountable. But you can see it's sort of many degrees removed and it's difficult. So those things are hard to enforce actually, and generally are. What about here? So on to the next one. This is about drugs in animal production. So there's about 450 drugs approved for animal agriculture. Most of those allow animals to be fed drugs on a daily basis, both to promote their growth and to prevent disease. It's not a practice we use in humans because that would be not very smart, but it is something that we still allow. And you can pretty much buy off-the-counter drugs from tetracyclines to streptomycins to all sorts of things in order to put those into animal feed and kind of try to keep things artificially clean, I think is the hope. Anyone know who's responsible for regulating that use in animal feed, drug use in animal feed? FDA, right. So it's interesting because FDA is really responsible for what's going into the chicken, right? The feed, the drugs that are in the feed. USDA is sort of responsible for the chicken and the labeling. On eggs, does anybody know who's responsible for the labeling on eggs? It's FDA, and that's different from USDA, right? So it's very strange. Who regulates the egg? Yeah, that's very good. Yes, and it's FDA. So the USDA regulates the chicken and the FDA regulates the egg. It's something we can use in different talks. Just sort of illustrates the craziness of it all. Yeah.
So throughout this whole process, you mentioned mainly 2 agencies, but the one that I'm surprised we haven't heard about is the Department of Health, because they should, all 3 of them should be working together when it comes to food. What role do they play in our nutrition?
Yeah, and the Department of Health and Human Services, right? And they oversee, the CDC is under them. And the Centers for Disease Control are really important because they're the ones who are documenting the illnesses in the humans and the foodborne illness rates. And so the problems are very quantified by CDC. And then the USDA sort of has to decide, oh, there's more illness, Vibrio illnesses happening. Gee, I wonder where they're happening and in what foods or on what farms. And FDA is supposed to think about what retail foods might be selling it that might be high risk as well. And so the Department of Health and Human Services is focused on the human. And that's fine. We need a focus on the human, but we certainly need these agencies coordinated with one another if we're ever going to get to, say, an outbreak and tracking and getting things off the market as soon as possible. So your question's a really good one. USDA and FDA, I think FDA falls under DHHS, but not USDA. And so it is still very fragmented in terms of the oversight. The regulations for food were generally written into the authority of the Food and Drug Administration and the USDA. And there's a little bit for one other, but I don't want to give it away yet until we get to it. Okay. So this is what came out of the bird. It's the compost, it's the manure, and then that can get composted. We just started looking at compost standards for conventional manures. Does anybody know who is overseeing that? EPA? So EPA is not a bad answer, and if it were a confined animal feeding operation, like so big, producing so much manure, then EPA does regulate it. But if it is anything less than a confined animal feeding operation, that's below a certain size and number, EPA doesn't regulate manure on the farms. Does anybody have another idea then who it would be? It's the Food and Drug Administration. So that's newly granted to them and their authority under the Food Safety Modernization Act. they don't really understand compost very well, but that's where it went. And so
What was the theory behind that?
in terms of having more authority over the farm, they gave that to FDA. I think there's a lot of people in the policy world that really question that, because USDA seems like a better fit for farm management and farm standards, and they also have many more requirements on the farm. I'm sorry, I meant to have the USDA label on here, but you know, the USDA, when it comes to organic standards, is actually regulating almost all of this except for the drugs. It all falls under USDA. So if you see an organic label on it, it's USDA that managed the composting standards for that product under that label. And so it's just completely bifurcated depending on maybe what production system it went through, and in this case, or what size it is. So it has different ramifications for it, and there are different standards for it as well. So one thing, FDA has been working on compost standards in general. The only thing that was even in existence out there were the standards under the organic standards. So it was a good place for us to start. I think they did start close to that in terms of a minimum day composting standard, a minimum temperature that it had to get up to at least in order to have effective composting. Again, compost being a really big vector of pathogens and antibiotic resistance. So composting that well is really important. Does anybody know what this is a picture of? It's not pesticide. It is a sprayer.
Fertilizer of like animal waste.
That's right. It's fertilizer of animal waste. And it's waste that doesn't even have to be treated, that can be sprayed directly on a field. This goes on in North Carolina quite a bit. In fact, there are people who live no less than 10 feet from a sprayer of a very large industrial farm, and that is legally allowable. And so again, the issues with pathogen spread directly onto the field and things like that are a big problem. Who do you think oversees that? It's EPA. And it should be USDA. I mean, you know, the fact that you think it's one of these and the other, I mean, the whole exercise of this is yes. I mean, there's a logical way this could fall, and then there is an illogical way that this can fall. And I mean, that's what this sort of exercise is all about. And so at the end of the day, you know, this, and there's more in our food system too we can talk about, but this is a sort of very fragmented system. Michael mentioned one thing I worked on at Consumer Reports was arsenic, and we looked at arsenic in rice, and there are certain foods that take up arsenic if it's in the soils, and rice is really one of those. Apple juice and grape juice also have high levels of arsenic relative to other juices. That has to do with old arsenical pesticides that were used. And cotton had a lot of arsenic applied to it too. So where we raise poultry is where we raised cotton, is where we raise rice in the south central United States. It's very laden with arsenic. So when we briefed all the agencies about it, you know, we had a greater goal in mind, which was to deal with all the ways we're compounding arsenic in our food system, and also to get the rice industry to start looking at that as an actual issue. Does anyone know the agency that's responsible for growing rice? Thoughts?
Something to do with water.
It's USDA. So it's not just animals at USDA, it's also growing rice at USDA. And there was so much arsenic in the soil at one point that it was leading to this disease in rice plants in Arkansas in that general area. It was called straight head disease, and it actually, you know, just completely threw off the yields for rice, and it's a rubbish plant if it gets that disease. So the USDA, this is about 20, 30 years ago, helped to cultivate strains that would tolerate those levels of arsenic in the soil down there. But what they didn't do was actually look at the levels of arsenic that were being taken up by those rice cultivars. And so that is something that has changed now, which is really great, but it is something that the USDA didn't really have on their radar until tests actually came out to prove it. It's a little disconcerting that FDA has been testing food every year. They put it in the total diet study, all the heavy metals and pesticides that they test in the samples that they do test, and it was all there for years and years and years. And at Consumer Reports, we were sort of trolling that data and wondering, well, what's the next thing we should look at to test? So to us, it wasn't a mystery. The government itself had actually discovered the high levels of arsenic in the various foods, and that rice was particularly problematic. So was apple juice. But USDA and FDA never really talked to each other about that, and so there was never really any research done to start to actually get to the root of the problem. So they are doing that now. There was something going on though at FDA that involved arsenic. Does anybody know what that was? Yeah.
Isn't it an approved additive to chicken feed?
Yeah, very good. So it was an approved additive to poultry feed. It pinked the meat a little bit. It acted as an sort of parasitic agent, kind of like an antibiotic. In fact, they were classified as antibiotics and antimicrobials. One of our goals when we put that study out on rice was to get it out of chicken feed. And so we actually worked with the organic industry and Johns Hopkins at the time, and went down and met with FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine along with Food and Water Watch to say this is completely ridiculous that you are feeding these animals arsenic, that it goes out into their manure and then it goes to fertilize crops like rice and other crops and can get taken up by those crops. So it's just silly that we are actually compounding arsenic in our food supply. The victory, and I say it with quote unquote, is that FDA made a deal with the pharmaceutical industry to withdraw their drug approvals for arsenical-based compounds. So that was mainly with US-based companies. If somebody really, really wanted to get their hands on it internationally, it's possible to do it because there's not a law that actually bans the use of arsenical drugs. That said, it's part good news in that FDA at least got US drug companies to withdraw any approved arsenical drugs for poultry production in this country. So it's not easy to get. And that was really the best we did at that point. FDA finally did start to, by the way, FDA set standards for rice for arsenic. So even though USDA is responsible for growing it, it's FDA that would set the standard, and they did in fact set it for rice baby foods. There's at least a decent standard in place, and they have set one for rice. It's not really adequate, but at least something got on the books where there wasn't anything before. So again, it's very interrelated. You look at all these things and they all sort of cross-relate to one another and into other crops as well. And this is just an illustration from the point of view of the chicken, where regulation and oversight of getting that animal or any product from that animal and how it was raised to the table involves several different agencies, many of whom don't talk to each other on a regular basis. I will say one thing, that there was an interdisciplinary group set up with CDC, USDA, and FDA for antimicrobial resistance. And that's because that has been deemed a public health, world health crisis. And so for that, they decided to form an intra-agency group, and they actually do very, very good monitoring of antibiotic-resistant pathogens in humans, in the food supply. And that's been really helpful for some of these outbreaks that have occurred. Okay, so I'm going to just change gears a little bit and kind of talk a little bit about let's answer questions.
Sorry, quickly. Sure. Would this chart look similar for packaged produce?
Yes, it would. It would. We didn't talk about pesticides, but the standards are set by EPA, application of that on the farm is going to be probably a USDA executed event. So, again, it will have slightly different pictures, I think, that are up. But yeah, it's sort of a montage of different agencies. Yeah.
Also, on the flip side, it's very privatized who is creating the standards for cage-free, if you want to use that label on your packaging, correct? It's not regulated, really.
Well, cage-free has a legal definition by the USDA, so if you want to use that on a chicken product, you have some, they can't be in the cage. The FDA doesn't have a definition, so on eggs they can get away with it and not be subject to that same level of enforcement, which is just silly because it's the same animal. But they don't. And so in some ways, I guess just to say that the labeling of these things can be just multifaceted and multi-agencyed into there. So it's not always good. There's also private labels that do a good job. And so there's organic, which is run by the USDA. They verify things that are cage-free, quote unquote. But if you just see that on a package, it means a company put it on there. And as long as they're within bounds, they can pretty much say what they want to. The natural label is probably the worst because companies can say absolutely anything they want to and just put it on. You can't just do that with organic. And I always say we can argue about whether organic is perfect or not, but there are a set of standards. You cannot put that seal on your product unless you meet the set of standards. And there are other private labels like Animal Welfare Approved and Ag Justice Project, which is a fair trade label. They're private labels, they're good labels, and they're independent. And so I would just say don't draw the lines necessarily on public versus private labels. I think you can have a lot of good labeling. Sometimes private certifiers are just able to do things more quickly, more nimbly. You can augment standards, and you can often have higher standards than the government can usually maintain. So biodynamic, for example, is a private standard, but it's better than organic. So, you can't draw your lines necessarily, the litmus by that. Are there any other questions before I shift gears a little bit? Okay. So one area I've been working a lot on in the last year is about the new wave of alternative meat products that are on the market. And so I'm talking about things like the Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, and a lot of the new ones that are out there. And there's a lot of issues they sort of clump together under that particular product category. So GMOs and the use of those, processed food ingredients, and lack of transparency that goes on. And there's a lot of issues whether or not you get to the end of that and think, yeah, all right, I would buy that, or, oh my God, I don't want that. It's a lot of things that are very hard to get at from the ingredient panel. And so we have been working a lot with NGO groups out there like Friends of the Earth and Consumer Reports, as well as you've been doing a lot of work on this, on what's going on behind the scenes of that. So I want to take you through some of the report that Friends of the Earth did. It's called From Lab to Fork. You can look that up online and really read through the details of it. But I wanted to at least take you through some of the questions that have been highlighted about this particular industry. It's heavily funded through Silicon Valley venture capitalists. It's really trendy. A lot of money is being sunk into it, and yet the oversight of this area and of multiple parts of it are in question. And it kind of highlights not only trouble with this particular product category, but with processed food in general, and kind of brings a lot of those issues to the fore. So I'm going to walk you through this table that is in that report, and I'm sorry I don't have it cited properly on here, but this is from the Friends of the Earth report, From Lab to Fork. The The report itself covered two different types of meat. One is the lab-grown meat that's taken from animal cell culture. The other is through proteins that are manufactured through genetically engineered organisms. So, we've talked about some of these companies, and really, like, you can genetically engineer yeast, bacteria, and algae to produce whatever protein you want it to produce. If you want it to produce a milk type protein, an almond protein, a nut protein, a meat protein, you can actually now start to program that in. And the technology has moved from, I would say, slightly more crude genetic engineering like that occurred in corn and soy and really didn't yield all of the benefits we were hoping for, to now things called CRISPR. So it's where you can modify the gene even within the same organism. So the non-browning potato and non-browning apple are examples of that. Engineering these yeast and bacteria is some hybrid of the two, where they put in genes from something else into one of these microorganisms to then incubate these organisms and through the fermentation technique get what they want out of it. It is not a pure technique, it is not a precise technique, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the inadvertent results that happen from that technique. But what it is meant to produce something, and you are meant to then extract that from the yeast or the bacteria in order to use that. So xanthan gum is a great example of an ingredient that's made from bacteria, and then it ferments the bacteria to make the xanthan gum slime, and then that slime is extracted from the bacteria, and that's xanthan gum. And that's what's added to things. So ingredients can be so deceptive sometimes because you don't really know what's behind them. And things like processing aids, like yeast and bacteria, are not required to be on the ingredient panel. So these are things you won't know about unless you sort of do that digging behind it. I'm gonna let you all maybe learn a little more about the lab meat side. I will maybe say in summary, it is an attempt to use less animals, and while noble, it uses animals in order to get the cells to begin with. You also need serum from fetal animals in order to grow cells. And unless you immortalize them, which means you put a cancer gene into it to immortalize it, that's how scientists immortalize cell lines, you have to keep harvesting the cells from an animal. So, and if you don't use fetal animal serum, the next horizon is to genetically engineer a serum that has the nutritional sort of benefit. So those are all the things going on in that particular category right now in that industry. Right now it does not make economical sense to grow lab meat. It costs a tremendous amount of money. But that industry, again, being very well funded, is looking for ways in which to reduce that cost. But they do have these other barriers that they're going to have to deal with. Again, these aren't any kind of things that are going to be on the ingredient panel when you buy the products. I guess sorry about that. I did not put all of the other, I thought I had my other slides on here. Oh, there it is. In terms of regulatory safety assessments, there's very little that's required. FDA actually doesn't require anybody to notify anybody of any new ingredient, GMO or not. You want to put a new ingredient into the food system, you are free to do that. And you don't have to actually tell the FDA before you put it out onto the market. GMO ingredients are not required to be labeled as such, so if there's a GMO yeast making something, you will not see all of that information on the ingredient panel. And so there's a transparency problem in terms of understanding everything that goes on behind it. There aren't very many safety assessments required by the government before these things get onto the market. We can talk more about it if people have questions. But that is the current status of these products, are able to get to market before really any assessment's been done. The health impacts are not being studied all that well because, again, to Michael's point earlier, when companies own the technology and own the products and own the trademarks and own the technology, they own also the right to test those products. So they have to grant other people the right to test their products if other people or universities want to test them. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about the Impossible Burger. It's one example. It's a popular one out there. It's why I'm focusing on it for this talk, but it's by no means the only one with some of these issues behind them. The Impossible Burger. So this is a poster of what ingredients that are in meat replacement products versus just meat. And so, you know, it's over a dozen ingredients. And if you look at these products on the back in this store, you'll see it. There's protein concentrates of a variety. There's pea protein, soy protein, wheat protein. And what I just like to remind people is that the protein doesn't fall out of these plants. They are heavily chemically extracted out of these plants, and again, all those chemicals are considered processing aids, so they don't end up on the ingredient list. So when you see a protein isolate from a vegetable, even if it's not GMO, think about all of that goes on behind it in order to make those things, because it's a huge amount of energy, chemical, and resource in order to extract enough pea protein or enough of these proteins in order to start putting them into these alternative meat products. Natural flavorings, you know, smoke flavoring, caramel colors, all of these things are being found in these products, and those are ingredients that we are learning more and more are unhealthy in our diet and are part of a greater processed food issue. And in case of Impossible Burger, they actually wanted to create a bleed to the burger, and so they genetically engineered a yeast to make soy heme, and soy heme is a heme. So it's an iron-containing compound that holds oxygen in our blood and it keeps it red. And they engineered a lot of soy heme. So soy heme, apparently they found this in the root of soy plants, so they say it's natural, it's heme, it's, you know, from the soy, but it's an engineered yeast that's been now made to produce it. So it made the yeast. It made the hemoglobin that they were looking for, this leg hemoglobin, but it also ended up making 47 other heme proteins. And initially, Impossible Foods decided to see if they could maybe one-up their competitor and go to FDA with their new ingredient and their new product and have a blessing of FDA. It was completely optional for them to do that. They didn't have to do that. But they did, and FDA came back with a number of different concerns about it, including the fact that none of those 47 proteins had any testing or safety, and they were all new food ingredients to the market. You don't see those 47 ingredients on the package. They're not listed. They're listed under yeast extract. So this is the ingredient list of an Impossible Burger, and it looks a textured wheat protein. That's so nice. Like, that's very natural and grew in the fields. It didn't grow in the fields. It, again, was a very processed product. Potato protein, again, very processed. Natural flavors, anything that says flavor or fragrance can have dozens and dozens of ingredients behind them. I'll get you in just 1 second, okay? Then there's this leg hemoglobin. So that was the one heme they wanted to get out of that yeast. But because they had all those others, they also had to, and they couldn't even extract it out of the yeast, so it goes in as yeast extract. That's the 47 other ingredients that are in there. And then you have gums, you've got more protein isolates, and then some added vitamins. This is where they make the soy heme. So it happens in a lab, in fermentation tanks. It is factory-generated meat. It takes a lot of water, it takes sterile conditions, it takes a lot of energy. You have to keep things at certain temperatures all the time, so it's a very resource intensive kind of product. Is that the sustainable solution to conventional animal ag production? You know, these are the things that we're trying to have conversations about, and where is the accountability here? And so if these industries want to go forward, they need to also be held accountable for making sure that what they're putting on the market is safe. The other interesting thing to note is that the iron content in Impossible Burger is nearly double what it is of a regular burger. And I don't even think we even understand what the health implications are of that, but that's very strange. And so now we're starting to get into food that we're even giving different nutritional profiles to through ingredients that have never been on the food market. So I want to answer your question, yeah.
So I've read a little bit about this, and I don't understand how there's 40 different types, because if they put one gene for the soy heme, how did it have 40 different types? Were they spontaneous isoforms that formed? Was it splicing events? Like what happened?
Thanks for asking that question. It's really an important one because there's a lot of marketing that goes on behind this, which is, you know, we've got it, it's one gene. Reprogramming one gene does not necessarily lead to one protein being produced. And that's the fallacy in all of GMO technology as it relates to food, whether it's a plant, an animal, or anything else. And that is that we simply don't have control of changing one gene and knowing what's going to come out the other end. We just don't. Yeah.
But, I mean, also I thought it was through the isolation process, other proteins are brought down with it. It can't be totally pure, but they tested those to see if they had like allergenic motifs in the proteins.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they all tested to not be allergenic. So I just am wondering.
Yeah, and allergenicity is definitely important, and you know, now we finally have an FDA that regulates allergenicity. That didn't happen for a long time. So these companies are doing kind of the bare minimum they need to in order to screen these things. The 47 proteins are not a byproduct of isolation, they're a byproduct of that engineered gene. So that's how they came to be. And the fact that they can't extract those from the main one that they want means you've got a whole clump of 48 proteins. You know, I'm sorry, how much time do I have, Michael? I don't want to...
We have another half an hour.
Okay, all right, good. I spoke at the Edibles conference last Friday, and we were talking, it was called Food Loves Tech, or Tech Loves Food. I don't know which way it was, but... And you know, when I started my graduate work in 1990, you know, we took I was in an environmental health program in a school of public health, so smoking was the big environmental health hazard. And we studied oncogenesis. We studied like how cancers actually occur. And you know, in general, there's an environmental and a genetic component, and you get these disruptions in your genetic material that then lead to cancer. So whether that's through a hormonal system and you start to send things off course, that's how cancer and a lot of diseases arise. So I remember during my time in graduate school, they were doing the genome. They were getting the genome up and running. It was costing millions and millions of dollars. It was happening at the school I was at, so it was really interesting to hear the seminars and the mapping of the entire genome. I don't understand how scientists got from mapping the genome to thinking we could control the genome, because at that point, we were just trying to match up things, disruptions that we were understanding to the whole genome to see if, okay, maybe if it disrupts here, do you get another disruption over there? And how do we think about coming at this as kind of a problem-solving tool? And so I have never, as a scientist, understood how any scientist sort of thinks themselves bold enough to be able to change something at the genetic level and know exactly what they're going to get out. It hasn't happened. It isn't happening. The GE salmon, for example, in the making of that has created many mutants of salmon in the process in order to try to isolate the one salmon genetic strain that they want. And so I think when you listen to that marketing and you listen to sort of the promises of GMO technology and the precision of it, the data is not there that backs that up. And I'll tell you that there is a scientist who worked at Monsanto who developed the non-browning potato. And even that is sort of, seems innocuous. Cornucopia.org has posted his article that is written in this scientist's own words. And I really encourage you to read it because he was absolutely in love and fascinated by the technology, and he himself came to realize that he wasn't really in control of anything. And he left Monsanto and he no longer works there, and he wishes he had never developed this potato that is now on the market, but here we are. And still, his words are really important, I think, for all of us to kind of read and understand how someone who was so enthralled and in the middle of developing these things, from a scientific perspective, has found it implausible and not feasible in the long run. Okay, so again, just to summarize, we get new ingredients, they can go out to market, they don't have to be proven to be safe, they don't have to necessarily all be disclosed. We already have old ingredients under what we call a system called generally recognized as safe, which is the FDA's so-called safety assessment of ingredients. It doesn't require anything. It's sort of a debunked program that they still sort of claim has oversight of the safety of ingredients, but it really has no teeth. And then we've talked about how all of the processing chemicals don't have to get included. When you see things like refined oil, all those oils are extracted with hexane. You want to look for expeller pressed. Expeller pressed means that it pressed it from the plant. So chemicals are used in so many different things and so many different ingredients, especially those used in processed foods. And that's, as we know and we learn over time that those are associated with bad health outcomes. So as I said, there can be a lot of secret ingredients in your food, and GRASS is this program that does not actually ensure the safety of our food additives. And the fact that even the American Academy of Pediatrics says it, it really is astonishing how broken down that system is and how many of these very new, very different products are getting out onto the market. Okay, I'm going to shift gears just really quickly to share a story with you about high fructose corn syrup. And this was probably about, 8 or 10 years ago. And the corn industry lobbied to change the ingredient labeling of high fructose corn syrup, and they wanted to call it corn sugar. And they petitioned the FDA so that they could change it on the ingredient list. They started a website called cornsugar.com. They put out lots of information, and they started advertising almost immediately as corn sugar. So that sort of fell under FTC's jurisdiction, the act they were taking right now, or at the time, which was to put it on TV. And in the meantime, they were waiting for FDA approval. And, sort of a nice strategy, right? Because if it's already out there in people's consciousness and in advertising as corn sugar, maybe you get better sway at the FDA at the end of the day. So there were a lot of groups that took umbrage with this. And, there's lots of controversy around high fructose corn syrup. And I don't even necessarily want to go into all of those controversies, but talk about what ended up sort of preventing this change from happening. A lot of groups went in on safety into the FDA and the FTC and said, look, high fructose corn syrup, we don't know if it's as safe as sugar. But that industry had already come up with all their fructose, glucose percentages. It can be exactly the same as table sugar, and so why not call it sugar? And I was pretty, as a scientist, I got it. I got how they could say that because there is not certainty on the side of high fructose corn syrup being proven to be unsafe. There are some interesting studies of rats that eat more of it if it's there compared to sugar, and maybe it's more addictive. Excuse me, there's also information on when you up the levels of fructose in any kind of sugar, and there's a 55% and a 90% high fructose corn syrup, which relates to the fructose concentration. That can be, that can change the glycemic index significantly. So there are legitimate safety and health questions around it. But I knew that the agencies couldn't and wouldn't operate just on that amount of information. And so I remember saying to the other consumer groups we were working with, National Consumers League and some others, that we at Consumer Reports are not going to go in there on the safety bend, because that was not going to tip the agencies. And we actually went in on the natural bend and whether or not it was really corn sugar. And so in order to do that, we basically went in with a long petition, but that described how, in fact, high fructose corn syrup was manufactured. That this so-called sugar, in the end, did not get squoze out of a corn as sugar. It started as starch. You have to use acids to actually break up all of the components in corn. So to get the starch and the protein and all those things to separate, you have to use heavy acid digesters in order to get that to happen. And then you've got to process that and isolate your ingredients. Then once you have the starch, then you add enzymes to it and you start to chemically change it into sugar. You never see those enzymes on the package because they're, again, processing aids or food contact substances, which are not required to go on ingredient lists. But this process is what illustrated how different high fructose corn syrup was from table sugar, and why to call it corn sugar would somehow imply that it was the sugar that was extracted from the corn. That's not the case. It was something that was extracted but then had to be chemically converted into the sugar that they wanted. And that, at the end of the day, is what convinced the FTC and was part of their rationale for why they then said, no, you cannot call it corn sugar anymore. The FDA, I think a year later, finally concurred with that, and that industry has not been able to now co-opt the word sugar for its product. It's high fructose corn syrup, that's what it is, and that's what they have to call it. And again, this is just another way to look at some of the chemistry that has to go on. Again, the factory you saw before for the heme, very similar for high fructose corn syrup. It's very energy intensive. A lot of mercury is used at the plant to process things. These ion exchange columns that you see at these levels, and the magnesium activator, this is a very chemistry intensive process in order to get this out. All of these things, whether you're purifying or evaporating or separating, like all these things require a lot of infrastructure in order to get that done. And here you can see the various enzymes, fungal amylase, any of these ACEs, but sometimes the enzymes that are used are coming directly from bacteria as well in order to do this. Again, a big process. You're only seeing high fructose corn syrup on the ingredient list, not really anything behind it. But that, at the end of the day, is what ended up swaying FTC to do the right thing. So at this point, I wanted to, Michael, go into food print, if that's okay.
Great.
Can I type that in?
Yep.
So I'll just talk maybe while you get it up. Thank you. So,
The website?
Foodprint.org. So we, at the Grace Communications Foundation, fund a lot of progressive food efforts and have over the years. We just launched a new website called foodprint.org that really helps folks get to the issues, understanding the issues in depth, but then what can you do? And so, thank you so much. And so, in terms of, let me try and, it's a fast mouse. So, you know, we have a lot of things here. I want to just take you quickly to the Real Food Encyclopedia, which is really beautiful, and you can go into basically anything you want to. You know, we'll go into vegetables, and then it breaks down even further, and you can really start to dig down into any commodity and learn a lot more about it. And there's sort of a history and fun facts, but then what to look for when you're buying it, the sustainability, seasonality, and lots of things. So it's really chock full of that kind of information. Our seasonal food guide also sort of tells you what's in season at this time, so you can go to your farmer's market and find it. And then we also have the food label guide here, which kind of getting back to how do you make better decisions out there. There's a lot of labels that are helpful, and there's a lot of labels that aren't. And knowing the difference between them is what is really, I think, going to allow us as consumers to shift demand in a meaningful way, even when the government's not doing their job properly. And it's amazing to see what consumers can actually do, and sometimes that in and of itself goes upstream to change policy. So these, we've sort of mapped this out by commodity because they are and can be very different. Just to click on this for a moment. And this is sort of label by label, but know that when you see labels together, like USDA or Organic Welfare Approved, you're getting even more value to it. And so these are the criteria categories we use to evaluate every single label. And then under each of these, there are a number of specific criteria that we evaluate every single label by. And so you can go through and see what they are doing and what they aren't doing. And, you know, learning about sewage sludge-based fertilizers. This is our municipal waste that gets composted. Also same issues we were talking about before with compost and heavy metals. It's banned in organic production. Why don't we want to use these? Why don't we want to use synthetic fertilizers? So we do have these issue pages. We have reports. We've got short articles that kind of get you into all of those things and understanding the implications and the impacts. And finally, I will just leave you all with this, which is kind of our philosophy behind, you know, understanding your food print and the complexity of it, and sort of a blueprint for moving forward.
Our food print is the collective impact that the food we eat has on animals, the environment, and people. There are a lot of problems with our food system. This industrialized system has drastically increased our food print and favors the cheapest production practices while hiding the impacts to animals, public health, food workers, farmers, local economies, and the environment. Fortunately, not all of our food is plagued by these practices, but by the time the food hits the shelf, it's very hard to tell what's what. And at Foodprint, we want to change that. We believe that we all have a stake in producing our food in a way that's wholesome, fair, and clean, and that boosts local economies and preserves our resources for future generations. To make this future a reality, Foodprint provides the resources that everyone can use to build a more sustainable, fair, and healthy future of food. Changing the food system is going to take a lot of work, but through your food choices and your voices, there's a lot you can do to make a difference. To learn more about what you can do to improve your food print, explore the helpful tools and practical advice found on foodprint.org.
So thank you, and
Tutu, will you re-ask your question?
Oh yeah, my question is why doesn't the USDA and FDA as the supposed independent or unbiased body why don't they have scientific research going into all the claims that the industries are making so that consumers can have an unbiased information source?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah, the question is why don't these government agencies like USDA or FDA do their own research on some of these products that have a lot of questions around them? So we have some kind of independent look at them. And, I think a lot of it comes down to budget, and these studies cost an incredible amount of money to do in order to have enough numbers and statistical significance to make some levels of evidence. This more cynical side of me would say that there's a revolving door that goes on, and that I remember when we were doing arsenic in juice, and the FDA was furious, and they were saying, you're fear-mongering and there's no problem, and we're looking into it, but we can't believe you're talking about it. And the guy that was at FDA had worked for Nestle Juice for 25 years. Nobody really talked about that ever, but those of us who were slogging it in there knew that this guy was wearing a Nestle hat at the same time. I've seen people go from USDA and FDA into the industry after they retire, and sort of been sitting on opposite ends of the table with them there. And so I think in a lot of ways they're not incentivized. Their programs aren't incentivized to do that work. The budgets aren't incentivized to do that work. And they don't. And so it's unfortunate, and I think part of holding them accountable is to ask for more of that research. We do need more independent studies out there. I'm just not sure our government is the vanguard or the pioneers in that, unfortunately.
But it's because of lobbying.
Yeah.
There's much more money in lobbying
For sure.
than there is in the government budget.
There's a lot more in lobbying, and lobbying the government maybe not to look into certain issues, or by pushing industry data that suggests they don't need to. And a lot of that goes on. Yeah.
When you were talking about the arsenic found in rice, you mentioned that there was a study that had already found that correlation, but just that no one had analyzed it and enforced it.
Yeah.
What was that study?
That's called the Total Diet Study, and if you look that up, it's the FDA's Total Diet Study, and every year they publish new measurements, new tables, and they cover all the heavy metals, they cover a lot of pesticides. The USDA has their own pesticide residue testing program on produce that they publish under their jurisdiction. We have analyzed a lot of those databases, and I think what's startling is how much data is out there and how little they are doing to say, oh my gosh, there's a problem. I would say that the CDC probably does the best job of all, because they seem to be the most concerned with the eventual human health outcome of these things. But that is unfortunately kind of where it's at. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're talking about soy protein isolate and how hexane is used for that extraction process.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's like a certified organic granola bar, I would assume they couldn't use hexane for that extraction, and if so, like what would they use alternatively, and is that less detrimental to our health?
Yeah, great question. There was a very big debate in organic over carrageenan and the hexane extraction of carrageenan, which is a gum. Carrageenan in and of itself has some questions about it in terms of its health and safety. I'm sorry, so just ask your question to me one more time.
Yeah, so you were saying how we get soy protein isolate, we use
Yeah.
hexanes.
Oh, right. Is that allowed in organic?
Right.
I know it's a little bit of a gray area because it was a controversy, and food contact substances are now exempt from organic approval.
Say that again?
Yeah.
Food contact substances are exempt from organic approval for the national list. That happened as a result of a blueberry farmer suing the USDA in 2000 or 2002. And he said, look, the law says that you cannot put all these things out that have all these food contact substances in them. and it requires you to regulate materials used in organic production. And that word material became the subject of legal material and a complete showdown in the government, where the court ruled that the law was right. You could not let these products out that had food contact substances that had not been reviewed. But the Congress, in a backdoor meeting, and they put it on an appropriations bill, decided to change the law to comport with how the regulation was being implemented, which was to exempt food contact substances from being reviewed. And it was a big loss for organics at that time, because it really took a hit to the integrity, I think. But for the most part, it applies to processed foods, not always. We wonder when Impossible Burger goes to get their organic certification, how that's going to go for them. But these issues and then these loopholes start to make things possible that you would not hope for. So like hexane extraction, because is it happening because they're not regulating it? It's a little tough to tell. So it's really, I think, on those things, and when you're buying, the processed foods, check in with those companies. I will mention one other thing in organic, which is the Real Organic Project, which is trying to raise the bar on organic, and is a really interesting set of companies that have come together around that, and so they are trying to provide something a little bit better. There's also the Regenerative Organic Certified Standard that's going to come out later this year. That's a Rodale, Patagonia, Dr. Bronner led initiative that'll be implemented by Rodale, and there may be some additional standards for that as well. It's a good question. Yeah.
I'm curious, as a scientist, what do you think is the most safest and healthiest diet, like generally? What do we eat?
I think that, I'm not a nutritionist per se, and I'm a toxicologist, so I usually look at what things to avoid contaminant-wise, but I think that buying fresh food produced really well is one of the best things that you can do, so that your meat is produced well, your dairy is produced well, and your produce is produced well. And I think the more processed you get, the less valuable those production practices that you put in place become. That's not to say no processed food should be on the market, but I think for my own choices, I cook a lot. I try to buy fresh ingredients. I try to buy the least amount of boxed foods. I do think data comes out over and over again showing that there are health risks of high consumption of processed food products. I think there is a lot of information about, there's a new study out in France about eating organic diets and mortality rates compared to those eating conventional diets. I think it's amazing that kids that eat organic diets can have less pesticides floating through their bodies. And I think with all the cancers and diseases that we have today that we cannot explain, that looking at things we do every day, which is the food we eat and the air we breathe and the water we drink, has to be closely examined for where we are exposing ourselves to poor practices and poor healthy products, whether they're produced in an unhealthy way or whether they just are unhealthy at the end of the day. Yeah.
Hi. So I've read about sugar alcohols that make like Coke be calorie free or emulsifiers in ice cream altering the microbiome. And I was just wondering if you've read or seen studies like that, and if you have any.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on sugars. I will say I had gestational diabetes both of my pregnancies, so I got really used to looking at that and staring at all of that. And I think that there are glycemic sometimes contributions from those things that aren't well accounted for. I remember just for myself, I started avoiding all of them because they made me feel really ill and not well, and I think they were sort of tampering with my sugars. But that said, I think that their use is probably not, totally great, and I think there's probably not a lot of things that's well understood about them. I will just mention something quickly on the biome, which is that we are learning more about our biome and all of the amazing implications it might have, from the nervous system to the immune system, whether we're feeling depressed or not. I mean, it's fascinating. In addition to digestion, the soil has its own biome. And so when you put synthetic fertilizers and pesticides on that, you kill that biome. And that biome is responsible for the plant nutrient uptake, just like our biome helps us digest and process nutrients much better. So there's a very analogous thing going on in how we produce our food that we need to pay attention to, because we're actually ruining the foundation by which we impart nutrient density into our food, and it's a biome-related issue as well.
We'll do
Sure.
one last question.
Okay.
Can we talk about fish?
I think you should pick.
Can we talk about fish? Because between the microplastics and Fukushima, are we eating fish? Are we not eating fish? If the fish eats microplastics, like, is it taken out of its gut? Like, when we eat it, are we eating the plastic? What's happening?
I know. Microplastics are everywhere. I mean, we're all being exposed to it, and I think that the study that came out in salt is the tip of the salt iceberg. That said, it is absolutely a reason to start addressing it and doing things, because now we're realizing that something we just thought we were throwing away or badly recycling is ending up in very small form in everything. So pizza box liners, they've got also microplastics in it from the BPA that lines them. So microplastics are just simply everywhere. In terms of fish, I do think people should be paying attention to mercury, high mercury fish, especially if you're of childbearing age and getting ready to have kids. It's something you should pay attention to. In New York City, I think it's a very significant percentage of women are already at their limit of mercury. And again, whether it's sushi or canned fish, it doesn't really matter. So moderating your fish intake is really important, and paying attention to what it is. Paul Greenberg wrote a really great book called Omega-3s, and it's about fish. And he put himself on the USDA recommended diet for fish, and his mercury levels just shot through the roof. And so then he started to focus on the fish that were low mercury but still maintained the intake rate, and his mercury levels still shot up. So my lesson from his experience and his sort of literally becoming the guinea pig is there are benefits to fish. You probably want to diversify the fish you eat. You want to eat it in moderation as part of a diverse diet, and not have it be fish all the time, nor anything else all the time. And I think we kind of get back to that. And I'll just add that I find concentrated foods in general, this is not fish, but fish meal, it's power bars, it's anything that's concentrated, protein concentrates, will concentrate contaminants down into them. So people who rely on very concentrated food, I'm worried about them too, because I think, or like rice concentrated products, which may have a lot of arsenic. And so people who have gluten-free diets who are looking for all those things, those are metal exposure and contaminants, I think, are the things people need to pay attention to. So fish has its issues, but they cross over with other food issues as well. And
Any difference between lake and ocean fish?
no, not as a litmus test. I mean, it really depends on where you buy it. Farm versus wild, don't necessarily draw your lines on that either. Tuna's wild, but it can have very high levels of mercury, whereas farm salmon is often produced with a lot of drugs and a lot of feed that can be contaminated. So wild salmon is where your option is there. Monterey Bay Aquarium does a really nice seafood guide. They're also including contaminants in that. There are a few fish labels out there. They're not really that great. Whole Foods has obviously done a lot in terms of selling and overlaying the Monterey Bay list. They won't sell anything that's on the red list. So they're trying to source more sustainably. And then Sea to Table is another service that you can start to order sustainable fish online. I see that they're now serving consumers, not just institutions, so that's kind of exciting as well. And they're based here in New York. Obviously, the fish comes from everywhere, but they also try to source more sustainably as well.
Joshua, thank you.
Thank you.
It would be shameful of me, and I would be held accountable by my peers in the back there, to not say the best place to buy fish is at your local farmer's market, and buy smaller varieties that are caught locally, that are heavily regulated, so that they're not overfished. But thank you, everyone. Everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving next week. We're back in 3 Wednesdays, looking at public health. So thank you, thank you.